a chilling whisper carried on the wind through the vast, ancient peaks of the Appalachian Mountains, a whisper that for 17 long years had been Martin Davis's constant companion. It spoke of loss, of an unresolved ache that had settled deep within his bones, defining every sunrise and every star-dusted night. He was 45 now, his face etched with lines that spoke less of age and more of endless, unspoken grief. His hands, once strong and sure in their grip on a park ranger's rifle or a fishing rod, now moved with the weary precision of a man perpetually searching, perpetually waiting. Martin lived in the shadow of that whisper, managing a small, rustic hunting lodge nestled at the base of the very mountains that had swallowed his son. The scent of pine and damp earth clung to him, a constant reminder of the wilderness that held both beauty and an unimaginable cruelty. Every morning he walked the perimeter of the property, not just checking fences or tracking game, but with an unspoken prayer that perhaps, just perhaps, a familiar shadow would emerge from the tree line, a small figure that would shatter the silence of his solitary existence. He cleaned hunting cabins, stocked firewood, and exchanged polite, distant pleasantries with the few hunters who passed through, their excited chatter about deer and bear feeling like an alien language in his world of quiet desolation. His life had narrowed to this isolated outpost, a self-imposed exile driven by the desperate, illogical hope that by staying rooted to this place, he somehow remained tethered to Liam. 17 years earlier, the crisp September air had bitten at their cheeks as Martin and his 8-year-old son, Liam, led their small flock of sheep up to the high mountain pastures. Liam, a boy born with an innate understanding of the rhythms of the land, moved with an easy confidence that belied his tender years. He whistled to the sheep, a clear, tuneful sound that carried across the rugged terrain, and the flock responded, drawn by the boy's gentle authority. He was a natural, a true shepherd in the making, his small hands already capable with a crook, his eyes sharp for any stray. Martin had watched him that day, a swell of paternal pride filling his chest, a feeling as vast and open as the sky above them. But the sky, so clear just hours before, had betrayed them. A sudden, violent thunderstorm had erupted, its fury unleashed with terrifying speed. The heavens had ripped open, torrents of rain blinding them, lightning splintering ancient trees with deafening cracks. Panic had seized the flock, and in the chaos, amidst the bleating of terrified sheep and the roar of the wind, Liam had vanished. Martin's frantic calls, his voice raw with terror, had been swallowed by the storm. He had searched, desperate, until his lungs burned and his muscles screamed, finding only scattered, terrified sheep and the chilling, empty echo of his own voice. The subsequent search by rangers and volunteers had been exhaustive, spanning weeks, leaving no stone unturned, no crevice unexamined. Yet Liam and a handful of his sheep were gone, as if the very mountains had opened up and consumed them. The grief had been a living thing, a crushing weight that never truly lifted. It manifested not in tears, for those had dried up years ago, but in the permanent shadow in Martin's eyes, in the slight slump of his shoulders, in the way he always seemed to be listening, even when there was nothing to hear but the wind. Hope was a fragile, dangerous thing, a flickering candle in a hurricane. Yet he clung to it with the ferocity of a drowning man. He knew, rationally, that the chances of finding Liam after so long were infinitesimal, but the heart, battered and bruised, refused to relinquish its hold on the impossible. Every shadow cast by the setting sun, every distant bleat from the wild, stirred a primal instinct within him, a silent, enduring vow that he would never stop looking. The distant crackle of the park ranger's radio broke the morning's quiet, pulling Martin from his usual vigil at the edge of the tree line. It was Ranger Reynolds, his voice tinny and stressed. A late spring thaw, unusually rapid and fierce, had sent torrents of water cascading down the mountain slopes, triggering landslides and reshaping parts of the remote backcountry. The park needed someone with extensive knowledge of the area, someone who could navigate treacherous new terrain to survey the damage and identify potential hazards. Martin, with his 2 decades as a ranger before Liam's disappearance, was the obvious if reluctant choice. A heavy blanket of dread settled over him as he listened, each word a fresh wound. The assignment was for the section of the park where Liam had vanished, the high pastures and dense ancient forests that held both his most cherished memories and his deepest nightmares. It was the very heart of his pain, a place he had avoided for years, circling it like a wounded animal protecting its den. Yet, a flicker of something akin to purpose, dormant for so long, stirred within him. Professional duty, a concept that once defined his entire being, now felt like a desperate, hollow shield. But perhaps beneath that duty, a silent, unspeakable hope lay hidden, a chance to walk those paths again, to comb through the newly exposed earth, to uncover what the mountains had so fiercely guarded. He spent the next few days preparing, his movements methodical, almost ritualistic. He packed his old, worn hiking boots, a compass whose needle had guided him through countless trails, and a map of the area, its creases softened by years of unfolding and refolding. The wilderness of the Appalachians was a deceptive beauty. Verdant green in spring, it could turn treacherous in an instant. Towering hardwoods, ancient and gnarled, formed a dense canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns, creating an illusion of peace. But beneath the surface lay a labyrinth of rocky outcrops, hidden ravines, and sudden plunging drops. The recent floods had only intensified its raw power, tearing away earth, exposing roots that looked like grasping skeletal fingers and carving new, unpredictable channels through the landscape. As he drove his battered pickup truck deeper into the park, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to little more than a muddy track. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp, earthy scent of disturbed soil and decaying leaves. The familiar contours of the peaks rose around him, massive and indifferent, their granite faces scarred by time and elemental fury. He felt a profound sense of isolation, not just from the world below, but from his own emotions, which he had learned to compartmentalize over the years. This was merely a job, he told himself, a task to be completed. But with each mile, the weight of 17 years of unresolved grief pressed down, and the quiet whisper of his son's name seemed to intensify, carried on the very winds that had once stolen him away. He was heading back into the very maw of his personal tragedy, and though every fiber of his being screamed to turn back, something stronger, more primal, pulled him forward into the heart of the unforgiving, beautiful wild. The climb was grueling, each step a testament to the unforgiving power of the Appalachians. Martin navigated the treacherous terrain with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a lifetime in these mountains, yet even he was tested by the recent deluge. Rivers roared where trickles once ran, and entire sections of the forest floor had been stripped bare, revealing ancient bedrock and the skeletal remains of trees. He logged the damage, noting rockfalls and eroded trails, his eyes scanning for anything amiss, any sign of something that didn't belong. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine, a primeval perfume that filled his lungs and, for a fleeting moment, almost soothed the ache in his chest. Hours into his survey, deep in a ravine he remembered as always being particularly dense with undergrowth. Martin stopped abruptly. The ground here felt different, freshly churned. A massive, ancient oak, its roots ripped from the earth by the floodwaters, lay sprawled across a section of the hillside, its immense trunk creating a natural dam. Where its roots had once anchored it, the earth had given way, exposing a dark, narrow opening, almost perfectly concealed by mud and clinging debris. It was a crude, man-made cavity, a burrow carved into the side of the slope, previously swallowed by the dense foliage and layers of accumulated soil. A prickle of unease, distinct from the usual melancholy that accompanied him, ran down his spine. This was too remote, too hidden for a natural cavity. The air emanating from within was stale, carrying a faint, musty odor, It was the smell of disuse, but also, subtly, of something else. He knelt, scraping away the mud with his gloved hand, revealing rough-hewn timbers forming a makeshift frame around the entrance. This was no animal den. This was a deliberate construction, a hidden place in the wilderness. His heart, which had beat with a dull, steady rhythm for years, began to quicken, a frantic flutter against his ribs. He hesitated, a cold dread warring with an unshakable compulsion. Every fiber of his being screamed to back away, to report the unusual structure to the Park Service and let others investigate. But a deeper, more profound instinct, one that had been simmering beneath the surface for 17 years, urged him forward. This was the territory where Liam had vanished. This was the kind of place a lost boy, or someone hiding a lost boy, might seek refuge. A tremor ran through his hands as he peered into the darkness. The silence of the ravine pressed in around him, amplifying the frantic beat of his own pulse. The air grew heavy, charged with an almost palpable sense of forgotten secrets. He drew a deep, shaky breath, the metallic taste of fear on his tongue, and braced himself. He had found something, he knew, and whatever it was, it would inevitably lead him further into the heart of the mystery he had sought to solve for nearly 2 decades. The interior of the crude structure was a suffocating blend of damp earth and the heavy scent of disuse. Martin pushed further inside, his breath catching in his throat, the beam of his headlamp cutting through the oppressive gloom. The space was small, no more than 6 feet by 6, with a low ceiling supported by rough-hewn logs. The floor was packed dirt, uneven and cold. It felt less like a shelter and more like a tomb, a secret whispered by the mountains. His light swept across the walls. They were rough, unfinished, but on one of the larger, smoother logs, a detail caught his eye. Carved clumsily, yet undeniably familiar, were the initials L.D. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Liam Davis, his son. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a sickening lurch of hope and despair. He reached out, his fingers tracing the uneven lines, the simple letters screaming a truth he had refused to abandon. 17 years. 17 years of agonizing silence, and now a silent scream from the past. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he continued to scan the tiny space. His light then fell upon a small dark object nestled in a shallow depression in the packed earth, almost hidden by a scattering of dried leaves. He reached for it, his heart pounding a frantic drum against his ribs. It was a whistle, crafted from a piece of twisted bark, its rough surface worn smooth in places, no doubt from endless handling. Martin's thumb ran over the faint indentations, a primal recognition blooming in his chest. He had made this whistle for Liam, an improvised toy on one of their early sheep drives, teaching him how to use it to call the strays. He remembered the simple joy on Liam's face, the boy's determined puffs of breath as he tried to master the art of the shepherd's call. The blood drained from Martin's face, leaving him cold and clammy. This wasn't just a coincidence, a cruel trick of the light, or a figment of his tormented mind. The initials, the whistle, they were irrefutable. Liam had been here. He hadn't been lost to the storm, not entirely. Someone had found him, or, more terrifyingly, taken him. The revelation struck him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air in the confined space. The air in the hidden cache suddenly felt impossibly thin, stifling. His mind raced, a whirlwind of fragmented images and questions. If Liam had been here, where was he now? Who would keep a boy, a shepherd boy, hidden in such a desolate place? The dark corners of the cabin seemed to press in, filled with unspoken answers. A cold dread seeped into his bones, replacing the years of numb grief with a sharp, terrifying clarity. The mountains hadn't just swallowed Liam, they had hidden him, and the implications of that truth were more horrifying than any death could have been. He clutched the crude whistle, its familiar shape now a burning coal in his palm, and slowly, painstakingly, pulled himself from the dirt floor, his eyes fixed on the LD carved into the log, a silent testament to a life that had inexplicably continued just out of reach. The small, dark cavity of the cache seemed to expand in Martin's mind, transforming from a mere hole in the earth into a terrifying portal to the past. The initials LD pulsed before his eyes, and the crude bark whistle felt impossibly heavy in his palm. Liam had been here. That truth, raw and brutal, ripped through the scar tissue of 17 years of grief, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. But with the pain came a ferocious, almost violent surge of purpose. He hadn't been searching for a ghost. He had been searching for a hidden life. He emerged from the cache, blinking against the muted daylight, the familiar wilderness now imbued with a sinister new quality. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed to hold a sinister implication. He carefully covered the entrance to the cache, camouflaging it as best he could, a desperate measure to preserve the scene to ensure no one else stumbled upon his terrifying discovery. His mind raced, desperate for an explanation, for a face to attach to this monstrous secret. The first face that surfaced was that of Jeb Stone. Stone lived on the other side of the ridge, his sprawling, isolated farm bordering a vast tract of national forest land. He was a man steeped in local legend and whispered rumors, a loner with a reputation for a volatile temper and a fierce possessiveness over his property. Martin had encountered him occasionally during his ranger days, brief, tense exchanges where Stone's eyes, as cold and hard as river stones, held a defiant, almost hostile glint. He grazed a large herd of cattle, but his operations always seemed shrouded in an unnecessary secrecy. Trucks entering and leaving at odd hours, always heading for the deeper, more overgrown sections of his land. Martin had dismissed it then, another eccentric mountain dweller. Now, those memories burned with a new, terrifying significance. He remembered a fleeting glimpse years ago during one of his own desperate, unsanctioned searches for Liam. He had been deep in Stone's territory, ignoring the no trespassing signs, when he'd seen a small, indistinct figure in the distance, tending to what looked like a small flock of sheep near the boundary line. He'd dismissed it as a hallucination, another cruel trick of his grieving mind, a projection of his lost son onto the landscape. The figure had been too far away, too shrouded in mist, to be sure. But the image, once a vague sorrow, now sharpened into an unsettling suspicion. The shepherd boy, the sheep. It was too close to his own nightmare. A cold certainty began to congeal in Martin's gut. The official reports had been so definitive, no trace, presumed lost to the elements. But the mountains had a way of keeping secrets, and sometimes those secrets were held by men. Jeb Stone, with his guarded demeanor and his isolated domain, fit the chilling narrative that was rapidly unfolding in Martin's mind. The possibility was a terrifying weight, a fragile thread of hope woven with a suffocating blanket of fear. He had to know. He had to uncover the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter how long it had been buried. The old grief was still there, but now it was fused with a burning, relentless anger. He wouldn't rest, not now, not ever, until he had his answers. The drive from the park boundary to the nearest town felt endless, the familiar curves of the mountain roads blurring into a tunnel of urgency. Martin's mind was a maelstrom of thoughts, each one a fresh lash of pain and a renewed surge of furious determination. He replayed every interaction with Jeb Stone, every odd detail, searching for clues he had dismissed, for warnings he had ignored. The image of Liam's initials, raw and desperate, burned behind his eyelids. As soon as he had a reliable signal, Martin pulled over, his fingers fumbling as he dialed. John Harper, his old colleague, answered on the second ring, his voice gruff, accustomed to the odd hours of police work. Martin spoke quickly, his words tumbling out, laced with a raw emotion that startled even himself. He described the cache, the initials, the whistle. concrete evidence that ripped through the veil of presumption and despair. John listened, silently at first, then with growing seriousness. Martin could almost hear the skepticism in the detective's silence, but then the years of shared history, the unspoken trust forged in perilous rescues and long, cold nights in the wilderness, began to chip away at John's professional detachment. "I need your help, John," Martin finished, his voice strained. "I know this sounds crazy, but Liam was there. He was there." A long pause, then John's voice, lower now, devoid of its initial gruffness. "I hear you, Martin. It's a hell of a story, but you wouldn't be calling if you weren't sure. Meet me. I'll make some calls." They met in a nondescript diner on the outskirts of Asheville, the clatter of plates and muffled conversations a jarring contrast to the silence of the mountains. Martin laid out the evidence, his words precise, his conviction unshakable. John, now a detective, listened intently, his gaze sharp, assessing every detail. He was a man of logic, of facts, but he also knew Martin. He understood the kind of father Martin was, the kind of ranger he had been. He knew the depths of his despair and the gravity of a claim that could pull him from it. Over the next few days, under the guise of an environmental impact assessment, John began to pull strings. He discreetly accessed public records, analyzed property lines, and consulted with contacts in various agencies. What they uncovered was a slow, unsettling accumulation of data. Jeb Stone's farm was far larger than its visible footprint suggested, encompassing vast tracts of undeveloped land that extended deep into the mountains bordering the national park. His financial records were opaque, hinting at unusual cash flows and a network of shell corporations that seemed to exist solely to obscure ownership. There were also reports, dismissed as minor incidents over the years, of occasional altercations with hikers straying onto Stone's property, aggressive warnings about trespassers, and an unusual number of heavy equipment deliveries to remote parts of his land. Nothing concrete, nothing that would warrant a full investigation on its own. But woven together, it began to form a pattern, a faint outline of something hidden, something illicit. John's eyes, usually cool and detached, now held a glint of genuine intrigue. "He's got something going on out there, Martin," he said, tapping a pen on a map of Stone's sprawling property. "Something big. Too much land, too much cash, too many warnings. And given what you found, it fits. It's not just a farm, it's an empire, a hidden one." The realization hung in the air between them, chilling and heavy. They were no longer just searching for a lost boy. They were about to uncover a truth far more sinister than either of them had anticipated. With John's cautious validation of his suspicions, Martin felt a surge of grim energy. The vague unease that had settled over him for years now had a name, a direction. The next step was to gather more than just circumstantial evidence. They needed solid information, whispers from the mountain itself, clues that the official channels would dismiss but that he, a man who spoke the language of these hills, might find. Their first attempt was to canvass the scattered remote homesteads that dotted the periphery of Stone's vast property. Martin, with his weathered face and quiet demeanor, often found a rare acceptance among the fiercely independent mountain folk. John, in his slightly more formal attire, adopted the persona of a wildlife conservationist investigating unusual land use patterns. They approached with carefully crafted questions, steering clear of direct accusations, merely inquiring about Stone's operations, the movement of his livestock, the comings and goings of his workers. The reception was a wall of silence, as dense and unyielding as the Appalachian forests. Eyes, ancient and wary, would shift away. Shoulders would stiffen. Conversations would abruptly cease. A woman, with hands gnarled from generations of farming, simply shook her head and disappeared back into her cabin, the screen door creaking shut like a sigh. A grizzled man, whittling on his porch, offered only a curt grunt and a stare that dared them to press further. It was not outright hostility, but a deep-seated apprehension, a fear that was palpable in the strained silence that followed their inquiries. They watched, too, for Jeb Stone's workers. From a distance, concealed by dense foliage, Martin and John observed the figures moving on Stone's land. Many were young men, their faces etched with a weariness that went beyond hard labor. They moved with a hurried, almost furtive energy, their eyes often darting nervously towards unseen overseers. Some of them spoke to each other, their voices low, their words swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. Martin strained to listen, recognizing snippets of Spanish, sometimes a dialect he didn't quite place, hinting at transient, possibly undocumented laborers. Their faces told a story of desperation and fear, a silent testament to circumstances that drove them to such isolated, arduous work. They seemed to exist on the fringes, rarely interacting with the handful of local townspeople, their presence on Stone's property a well-known, yet unspoken oddity. The more they observed, the more the pieces began to fit into a disturbing mosaic. This wasn't just a reclusive farmer. This was a man who cultivated fear, who leveraged the isolation of the mountains to operate beyond the gaze of conventional society. The workers, too, seemed trapped, their silence less a choice and more a necessity. Martin felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. If Liam had been taken, if he had been forced into this hidden world, then the silence of these people wasn't just caution. It was a testament to the powerful, menacing grip of Jeb Stone. Every unanswered question, every averted gaze, screamed a warning. They were treading on dangerous ground, uncovering something far larger and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The mountains, it seemed, guarded not just their ancient geological secrets, but the dark truths of the men who sought to exploit them. The dead ends and the wall of silence surrounding Jeb Stone's operations gnawed at Martin. John, ever the pragmatist, was beginning to talk about the limitations of unofficial inquiries, the need for probable cause, a warrant. But Martin couldn't wait for paperwork. He felt Liam's presence, a faint, persistent echo, just beyond his grasp, and the thought of waiting, of following procedures, was unbearable. He needed a different kind of insight, one that flowed not from police files but from the deep, hidden currents of the mountains themselves. His mind drifted back to Evelyn. She lived in a ramshackle cabin, far off any main road, tucked away in a hollow known only to a handful of locals. Evelyn was an enigma, a woman who seemed woven into the very fabric of the Appalachians. She rarely came to town, preferring her solitude, her knowledge of the land legendary. They said she could predict the weather better than any meteorologist, find lost trails in the darkest night, and knew every animal, every plant, every secret that the mountains held. More than that, she possessed a quiet wisdom, an uncanny ability to see things others missed, to glean truths from the subtle shifts in the wind or the changing patterns of animal tracks. She was a witness to the untold stories of the hills. The trail to Evelyn's cabin was barely visible, just a faint deer path winding through dense thickets of rhododendron and ancient hemlock. Martin navigated it by instinct, the familiar scent of wood smoke growing stronger as he approached. He found Evelyn on her porch, frail but sharp-eyed, her face a map of deep wrinkles, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of working the earth. She sat on a worn rocking chair, carving a small bird from a piece of pine, her movements slow but precise. She didn't express surprise at his arrival, simply offered a silent nod and a gesture towards an empty stool. He spoke, slowly at first, about the unusual flooding, about his survey, about the changes in the land. Then he shifted, his voice dropping, carefully treading around the edges of his real purpose. He spoke of the LD in the cache, the whistle, the growing suspicion about Jeb Stone. He watched her face, searching for any flicker of recognition, any crack in her serene composure. Evelyn continued to carve, the soft scraping of wood the only sound for a long moment. Then her gaze, ancient and piercing, met his. "Jebstone," she murmured, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "He plays his own tune, always has. Moves things when the moon is dark. Been seeing new faces on his land, too. Faces that don't belong in these parts, but they move like they've been taught to hide." She paused, her eyes narrowing as if recalling a distant image. "And sometimes I'd see a boy, small, moved quiet like a shadow, tending to a small flock, not his own, not Stone's main herd. Just appeared, like a ghost in the morning mist. Always near the old boundary, near where the stream flows from higher up." Martin's breath hitched. A shepherd boy, a small flock, the stream near the boundary, the exact spot where he had caught that fleeting glimpse all those years ago. Evelyn's words, calm and unhurried, were a thunderclap in his soul. She hadn't seen the whole picture, but she had seen enough. She had witnessed the strange, unsettling presence of a child where no child should have been, a boy who moved like a phantom through Stone's forbidden empire. Her casual, almost offhand description of the ghost-like boy, years after he vanished, provided the chilling confirmation Martin needed. The evidence was no longer just initials and a whistle. It was a living memory, kept by the silent observer of the mountains. A tangible thread leading straight to Liam. Evelyn's quiet words, delivered with such an unsettling certainty, had solidified everything for Martin. Liam wasn't a ghost, he was a captive. The image of his 8-year-old son, suddenly overlaid with the mental picture of a wild, shadow-like figure moving through the mountains, fueled a cold, burning rage. There was no more waiting, no more deliberation. He returned to John, the story of Evelyn's observations adding a crucial layer of credibility. John, though still a man of procedure, could no longer ignore the undeniable pattern emerging. A missing boy, a hidden cache with direct evidence, a reclusive and hostile figure, and now, an independent, credible witness, however unconventional, speaking of a ghost boy on that very land. The pieces, once scattered and disparate, now snapped into a grim, horrifying picture. They spread a large-scale map of Jeb Stone's property across John's motel room table, the fluorescent light harsh against the detailed topographical lines. Martin, with his intimate knowledge of the terrain, pointed out every ravine, every hidden spring, every ridgeline. John, drawing on his detective training, outlined the logistical challenges, the remote location, the limited access points, the likely presence of lookouts. This wasn't a simple search and rescue. It was a delicate, dangerous operation to retrieve a potential victim from a suspected criminal enterprise. "We can't just storm in," John stated, his voice low and serious. "He's got something going on there, and he's been careful. We go in blind, we risk everything, and if Liam is there, we risk him." Martin nodded, his jaw tight. He understood the stakes. Years of ranger training, of strategic planning for wildfires and search operations kicked in. They would need stealth, surprise, and a clear exit strategy. The official channels, as slow as they were, had to be engaged. John spent hours on the phone, his voice hushed, speaking with the local sheriff, a man named Deputy Miller, whose initial skepticism slowly gave way to a grudging willingness to listen. Miller was a local, familiar with Stone's reputation, but he was also cautious, wary of accusations without concrete proof. John's calm, logical presentation of the accumulating evidence, combined with Martin's unwavering conviction, chipped away at his reluctance. They secured a preliminary green light for a discreet reconnaissance mission, a preliminary search warrant, based on the suspicion of illicit activity rather than a missing persons case, which would be too sensational and likely trigger Stone. The plan was simple in its core, terrifying in its execution, a night infiltration. They would approach on foot, using the cover of darkness and the complex terrain to their advantage. Martin would lead, relying on his intimate knowledge of the mountains to navigate the treacherous paths and evade Stone's perimeter. John would provide tactical support, his police instincts sharp, his presence a link to legitimate authority if things went sideways. They packed light, silent gear, night vision, compact radios, first aid kits. The air in the room grew heavy with unspoken tension. The weight of 17 years of longing and the terrifying proximity of a truth that could either shatter or heal Martin's world. The night ahead promised to be the longest of his life, a journey into the heart of a hidden beast, propelled by the desperate, burning hope of finding his son. The moon, a thin sliver of silver, offered little light as Martin and John began their ascent. The air was cold, damp, carrying the sharp tang of pine and the earthy smell of disturbed soil. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, transforming familiar trees into hulking, menacing figures. Martin moved with a silent, primal efficiency, his senses heightened, his old ranger instincts resurfacing with terrifying clarity. He led the way, his worn boots finding purchase on loose scree and slick rock, his knowledge of the mountains a sixth sense guiding them through the labyrinthine wilderness. John followed closely, his breathing even, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter, a silent, formidable presence at Martin's back. They moved for hours, deeper into Stone's vast, unmapped territory. The absence of traditional fences or clear property markers was unsettling, an indication of how thoroughly Stone controlled his hidden domain. Instead, they navigated by subtle signs, faint, unofficial trails, discarded cigarette butts, the distant, almost imperceptible hum of generators carried on the wind. The silence of the night was punctuated only by the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, and the frantic beat of Martin's own heart. As they crept closer to the heart of Stone's operation, the signs became more overt. Faint lights flickered through the trees, not the steady glow of domesticity, but the sporadic, isolated gleam of a work camp. The air grew heavy with the scent of something metallic, something acrid, mixed with the damp earth. They found a clearing, hidden deep in a fold of the land, where several makeshift structures stood. Crude cabins and larger, barn-like buildings illuminated by portable work lights revealed a flurry of activity even in the dead of night. Men, silhouetted against the dim glow, moved with an urgency that spoke of illicit operations. They were not farmers tending crops, but figures loading and unloading, their movements clandestine and hurried. Martin's eyes scanned the scene, his gaze unwavering, searching for any detail that might hint at Liam's presence. They crept to a vantage point overlooking one of the larger, more ramshackle barns. A single door stood ajar, casting a rectangle of dim yellow light onto the muddy ground. From within, Martin heard a faint, persistent bleating, the sound of sheep, and then a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness beyond the open door, a small, quick movement that was not quite human, not quite animal. It was a fleeting glimpse, a blur of motion at the edge of his vision, but it was enough. The shepherd boy. The image flickered, a phantom of Liam, now 17 years older, still tending his flock but trapped in this desolate, hidden corner of the world. Martin felt a desperate urge to rush forward, to call out, to shatter the oppressive silence and reclaim what was his. But John's hand, firm and steady, clamped down on his arm, a silent command for patience. They needed a plan, a moment, a chance to confirm, to act. The fleeting glimpse of the silhouette was a potent trigger, a confirmation that sent a tremor through Martin's entire being. Liam was here. He was alive. And he was very much still the shepherd boy, even after all these agonizing years. The full, terrifying scope of Stone's hidden empire with its forced labor and desperate secrecy was now laid bare before them, and in its darkest corner, a glimmer of the sun Martin had never stopped searching for. The fleeting glimpse, the recognition was a jolt of pure, agonizing adrenaline. Martin felt the primal instinct to surge forward, to break cover, to shout his son's name and pull him from the suffocating grasp of this hidden world. But John's grip on his arm tightened, a silent reminder of the plan, of the need for precision. They couldn't risk revealing themselves prematurely, not when Liam's life hung in the balance. They waited, frozen in the cold mountain air, for what felt like an eternity. The figure, undeniably Liam, had vanished back into the depths of the barn, swallowed once more by the shadows. The bleating of the sheep continued, a mournful, hypnotic sound. Martin's breath hitched in his throat, a silent sob of relief and terror mingling within him. He was alive. After all these years, after every crushing disappointment and every fading hope, Liam was alive. When the moment finally came, a shift in the rotation of the workers, a brief lapse in their vigilance, Martin and John moved. They circled wide, using the dense cover of the forest and the natural contours of the land, approaching the barn from an unexpected angle. The air grew heavy with the smell of livestock, of damp hay, and something else, a faint, unidentifiable human scent that sent shivers down Martin's spine. They slipped inside, the darkness momentarily blinding. The bleating grew louder, a cacophony of frightened sheep. Then, in the dim light filtering from a crack in the wall, Martin saw him. Liam. He was older, of course, a man now, lean and weathered, his face gaunt, his eyes holding a haunted, distant look that tore at Martin's heart. His hair was long, matted, and his clothes were little more than rags, but there was an unmistakable familiarity in the way he moved, the slight stoop of his shoulders, the innate connection he had with the agitated sheep around him. He was tending them, even here, even in this prison. Martin took a hesitant step forward, his voice a raw whisper, barely audible. "Liam!" The young man froze, his head snapping up, his eyes wide, feral. He looked at Martin, not with recognition, but with the startled fear of a trapped animal. The years in captivity had erased the carefree boy, replacing him with someone hardened, wary, almost feral. A rush of images, sharp and brutal, filled Liam's mind. The storm, the terror, the dark figures emerging from the trees, speaking in harsh, unfamiliar tones, being dragged away, disoriented and terrified, to this hidden place. The initial disorientation, the endless days and nights of fear, the realization that he was a captive. He had been forced to work, to tend the animals, to live a life stripped of freedom, his world confined to Stone's remote, brutal empire. He learned to survive, to blend, to disappear into the background. His shepherd instincts, once a source of joy, became tools for survival. Navigating the treacherous mountain paths with the sheep, finding hidden springs, learning to predict the movements of the animals, and, crucially, the movements of his captors. He had learned to hide, to be a shadow among shadows, to make himself invisible when necessary, to endure the harsh conditions, the relentless labor, and the suffocating isolation. He had carved the initials, a desperate, childish plea, a whisper into the wilderness, hoping anyone might find it. He had kept the whistle, a tiny defiant link to a life he barely remembered. Now, a stranger stood before him, a man whose face sparked a fleeting, almost forgotten flicker of recognition, but whose presence felt like a threat in the only world Liam had known for so long. He recoiled, his hand instinctively reaching for a nearby stick, his eyes darting towards the open barn door, ready to bolt. The years of fear and solitude had instilled in him a deep, ingrained mistrust. He was a wild creature, unaccustomed to human kindness, trained only in the art of survival. Martin felt a profound ache, a new kind of grief, as he saw the profound changes in his son. This was Liam, but he was also someone else, someone forged in the crucible of stolen years. The air in the barn crackled with a terrifying tension. Liam, a ghost of his former self, stood poised for flight, his eyes wide with a primal fear. Martin, suppressing the instinct to grab him, to hold him tight, instead spoke softly, gently, his voice a low, soothing murmur. A memory from a time Liam barely recalled. He slowly extended his hand, the small, crude bark whistle still clutched in his palm, a silent offering of a past that refused to be forgotten. Liam's gaze darted to the whistle, then back to Martin's face. A flicker of something, deep within those haunted eyes, shifted. A connection. The years of isolation, the brutalizing captivity, had stripped away much, but not everything. The sound of that whistle, the feel of its rough bark, was embedded in the earliest layers of his memory, a link to a tenderness he had long forgotten. Slowly, tentatively, he lowered the stick. It was in that moment, the fragile connection forming, that the muffled sound of approaching sirens, distant yet growing louder, pierced the night. John, having made the necessary calls from a safe distance, had coordinated their backup. The sounds, however, spurred Jeb Stone's men into a frantic panic. Shouts erupted from outside the barn, followed by the roar of engines and the frantic thud of running feet. The hidden empire was collapsing. Martin seized the opportunity. He lunged forward, not at Liam, but to slam the barn door shut, throwing his weight against it as the first of Stone's agitated workers appeared, their faces grim, their movements desperate. John was already moving, his voice sharp, identifying himself, bringing order to the chaos. The sound of official vehicles, now closer, echoed through the night. Headlights swept across the clearing, illuminating the scene in harsh, unforgiving beams. Jeb Stone himself emerged from one of the larger buildings, his face contorted with fury and disbelief. He barked orders, his voice raw, but his authority was crumbling. Uniformed officers, led by a surprisingly determined Deputy Miller, poured into the clearing, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their commands ringing with authority. Stone, caught off guard, made a desperate lunge for a vehicle, but he was quickly subdued, wrestled to the ground, his protest swallowed by the unfolding chaos. His network of forced laborers, shocked but undeniably relieved, began to emerge from the various structures, their fear slowly giving way to a bewildered sense of freedom. Amidst the shouts and the flashing lights, Martin turned back to Liam. The young man stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden intrusion, his eyes darting frantically from the officers to his father. Martin stepped forward, slowly, carefully, and this time Liam did not recoil. Martin reached out, and with a tenderness that spoke of 17 years of unshed tears, he wrapped his arms around his son. Liam tensed for a moment, then, slowly, tentatively, his own arms came up, clinging to the familiar warmth, a warmth he had thought lost forever. It was not a joyous reunion, filled with words, but a silent, desperate embrace, a physical manifestation of a broken promise finally, miraculously, being mended. The years of despair, of quiet searching, had finally culminated in this moment, a fragile, desperate reclamation under the harsh glare of an interrupted night. The harsh hospital lights seemed almost alien to Liam, a stark contrast to the shifting shadows and filtered sunlight he had known for most of his life. He lay in the pristine bed, the soft sheets feeling strangely foreign against his skin. His body, though malnourished and bearing the subtle scars of years of hard labor, was surprisingly resilient. It was his mind, however, that was still adjusting, grappling with the sudden, overwhelming influx of a world he barely remembered. Doctors and nurses moved around him, their voices soft, their touches gentle, a bewildering display of care he hadn't experienced in over a decade. Martin was a constant, comforting presence. He sat by Liam's bedside, a silent vigil that spoke volumes. He didn't press for conversation, understanding that his son needed time, space, and a gradual reintroduction to a world that had moved on without him. Sometimes Martin would simply hold Liam's hand, his thumb tracing patterns on his son's palm, a tangible anchor to a shared past. Other times he would talk, his voice low and steady, recounting simple stories of their life before, of the farm, of the sheep, of the mountains they both loved. He watched Liam's eyes, searching for flickers of recognition, small signs that the boy he remembered still resided within the hardened man. The healing would be a long, arduous journey. Liam had years of trauma to unpack, years of silence to break. He spoke rarely, his voice raspy from disuse, his words often disjointed, fragments of a forgotten language struggling to form coherent sentences. He seemed to understand more than he could express, his haunted eyes reflecting a deep-seated fear that sometimes surfaced, making him flinch at sudden movements or loud noises. Yet, there were moments, fleeting but potent, when the old Liam would resurface. A brief, almost imperceptible smile at a story about a stubborn ram, a distant look in his eyes when Martin spoke of the crisp mountain air, a yearning that was still deeply ingrained. Jeb Stone and his accomplices were swiftly processed through the justice system. The evidence of forced labor, illegal operations, and the long-held secret of Liam's captivity was overwhelming. The quiet justice of the law, however, felt insignificant compared to the monumental task of healing the wounds inflicted on Liam. As days bled into weeks, a fragile hope began to bloom in Martin's heart. Liam started to eat more, to sleep more soundly. He would sometimes reach for Martin's hand, a silent acknowledgement of their bond. One afternoon, Martin placed the bark whistle, the tiny, weathered piece of wood, into Liam's palm. Liam turned it over, his fingers tracing the familiar contours. Then, with a slow, hesitant movement, he brought it to his lips. A faint, reedy sound, barely a whisper, emerged. It wasn't the strong, clear call of a shepherd, but it was a sound, a beginning. Outside the hospital window, the Appalachian peaks rose majestically, their ancient slopes bathed in the gentle light of dawn. The storm that had raged for so long, both literally and figuratively, had finally broken. Stars began to fade, replaced by the soft hues of a new day. Martin looked at his son, his face a mixture of profound relief and an aching understanding of the journey ahead. Liam was not the same boy who had vanished, but he was alive. And for Martin, after 17 years of shadows and whispers, that was everything. The mountains had held their secret, but they had also returned his son, offering a fragile promise of peace, of healing, and of a future that, against all odds, now stretched before them, hopeful and unbroken.